So, hi, I'm Stephanie. Right now, I lead the content design team for payments in APAC. And at the moment, a lot of that is work in hyperlocal work in markets like India and Japan. So, we get to do some pretty cool things. Unlike some of our other markets, we do some fun things like in India, for example, you can actually buy gold on the Google Pay app, which is pretty cool. In Japan, you can add your loyalty card and see your points because points is big there. So we get to work on a lot of very cool, very specific things for markets. Where like it. Oh, can't quite see Stephanie. Is it just me? Let me make sure. Let me move back a little bit. Can you see me now? All right. I think I'm a little bit more in frame now. Okay. But yeah, I get to do a lot of cool stuff, hyper local in a lot of different markets. Not just me, of course. I've got a team here that does a lot of cool stuff. A little bit about me in my pre Google life. I first started out at a startup called Groupon, which isn't a startup anymore, but some of you who've been around for a little bit may have heard about it. What I did there was basically writing those deal descriptions you see under all the stuff we sell. So things from like what was the wildest thing we did? Things like edible candy underwear to getting a haircut, all sorts of stuff, all sorts of very, very fun stuff. But yeah, that's what we did. That's what I did at my first job. And over the last few years, I also got to do UX, a little bit of UX. I managed an editorial team. I did business operations at different startups. A lot of it was in e-commerce and payments. Also, fun fact, I have a law degree. And in my day-to-day work, one of the things I enjoy most about being in payments is that a lot of the work we do is pretty regulated. And I get to use that sort of skill in my day-to-day work as a content design person as well. So, I'm sure a lot of folks here are also from very, very different backgrounds because that's usually the case for content design. But I appreciate a lot the fact that I got to learn from so many different things, and all those things magically have been useful in my life today as a content design manager. All right. So today I'll be talking about UX, focused on writing across cultures, but writing is also UX. I won't be talking a lot about translations. Very quick caveat. I do think translations are so important, and I have so much appreciation for folks who work on translations where you have to look at something that's written in a different source language and then think about how you're going to magically, translate all that in a different language. So just, quick shout out to all the folks who do translations. And for others who do work with people who work on translations, please always be thinking about character length, sharing context, doing all those things. But before we go into the topic for today, I did have a couple of quick questions for folks who have joined us today. First one, what language do you write in? Okay, we've got English, French, English, Russian, Chinese, Brazilian, Portuguese. I had the luxury of working on a Portuguese feature a couple of years ago. So the one word I know, having worked in this space, is pagamento. All right, English, Japan, English, Japanese, Hindi, English, French, English, Spanish. So cool. Yes, we have got so many different languages, which is really, really, really cool. Which brings me to my next question. What's a fun challenge about UX writing in your language that might surprise other content designers? I can tell you mine. So, like, very quickly, while you also think about yours, I one of the markets I write for is India, where a large majority of our speakers do use our app in English. But English in India, as I'll touch a little bit on later, is very different from English elsewhere in the world. And so that's been a challenge, just thinking about words that are different, sentence structure, phrases that might resonate a little bit better in different countries. Yes, finding the English balance. Yes. Need to consider genders for every verb. Yes, that's not something I've had to think about yet, but I can imagine that must be really complex. Compared to Chinese, the words character counts are so long. GPay is now available in English, yes. And I will show you that a little bit later as well. All right. Very, very cool. And like while I move on to the next one, like please continue, sharing examples. Like it's always just so interesting to me just seeing how different people have navigated UX writing in different languages because there's so many things you don't realize until you actually encounter it. In Spanish, we need to use a pair of question marks or exclamation marks. Wow, it's my first time seeing that one. All right. So thank you all for sharing. That was really, really helpful. So before I go into the UX writing of it all, these this is not me. This is me on the right, the little person, but these are also my cute grandparents. I shared a little bit earlier how like all my experiences across like product and law and all these different things helped make me a better content designer. But I feel like the second thing that actually really, really helped me was the fact that, like a lot of folks that live on this side of the world, I grew up with my grandmother living with us. And like a lot of sort of maybe third culture children, I spoke to my grandmother in English, but she would speak to me in Malayalam, which is our mother tongue. Maybe some of you might have watched Shang-Chi a couple of years ago when the movie came out. But there was this scene in the movie where, like I think they were all at breakfast. The kids were all speaking in English. They had their grandmother there. She was speaking in Chinese. But that was very common. And I think how that helped me and something I realized a lot later on is that I always thought very carefully about how I was talking to her because even though I was speaking in English, I would usually have to be very careful about the words I'm using, think about simplifying the sentences, simplifying the language I was using, just because, like, yes, she could understand me, but there was a version of English which was a lot simpler that she understood. And the same way, like, I realized so much later as an adult, I always thought, oh my God, I'm so good at Malayalam. I obviously know Malayalam. And later on, when I had to actually talk to other people, I realized that my Malayalam was really bad because the Malayalam my grandmother was speaking to me was actually very, very simple. But I think it's something that all of us as content designers do a lot. And, especially if we're writing for markets where we've got people from so many different cultures, so many different literacy levels. It's something that we have to think a lot about how to write content, even though it's in the same language, in a way that resonates with so many different people. Yeah, if you've got a similar experience as well, like, I'd love to hear about it. Yeah, and I wanted to add a bit of color to that because it's not just me, right? Like I think it's an example of growing up in any sort of like maybe formerly colonized country, or even if you're growing up as an immigrant. For me, I grew up in Malaysia. I learned stuff in school in English. The apps I use every day in English. But obviously, my family, friends, we all speak English in a very different way. We all have very, very different levels as well. And yeah, here are some of my very favorite examples of how we use English differently. Anyone has quick guesses as to where these examples are from? Yeah, all English, but obviously, a different type of English. Taiwanese. All right, I'll give you a. I'll give you. I'll let you in on where they are all from. So the first one is from Sex Education on Netflix, but this is Nigerian. The second one is actually from Singapore. It's from a TV show in Singapore. And the third one is in from India. I love how "do the needful" is actually a phrase that's pretty common. And a recent word I actually learned was also prepone, which is the opposite of postpone. So if a meeting was tomorrow and you want to do it today, you prepone the meeting, which was, yeah, also very cool. And also just a little bit more before we go into the UX writing of it all. If you watch Squid Game, which was a couple of years back, and bear with me because I'll be using a lot of TV examples today, I did love the fact that there were so many news articles about, how all the captions in the show were a bit controversial. There was this scene, for example, where it was supposed to be a very heartfelt scene where someone called someone else Hyung. And in that scene, that got translated, I think, as brother. But apparently, there was this huge controversy about how the actual word carries a lot of meaning, and that meaning just didn't get conveyed by the translation, which meant the entire scene just like went over the head of most of the audience who are watching it in a different language. But also just very interesting in the sense that as UX writers, as we think about translations for different markets as well, sometimes there just isn't a word that adequately conveys the meaning of what we want to say in that language. I know we've got someone from Japan here who, fun fact, is actually on my team. But one of the very cool things we saw last year as well was I think we had a couple of fun words, one of which you may see in the app, which is poikatsu. And you should Google it. It's not a word that exists elsewhere, but it's a colloquial term for people who collect points. And because this is an activity that is very prevalent in Japan, this is obviously a word that exists in Japan. But for someone writing for this experience in English first, you would never have thought of introducing such a word in the UX. And you would have also not thought about the design in that sense, starting from that sort of like, a starting point where this word actually exists. Poikatsu, yes. And of course, this is a fun example from Malaysia, Singapore. Both countries use these very similarly. We're just adding a different suffix to the word, changes the meaning of what can actually means to us. Also very fun, last example on, all these like fun examples from languages is this. This is also from Malaysia. And this is actually 4 different languages. But if you were to ask any Malaysian what this means, most of them would know. It basically means, hey, big brother, do you want to eat here or do you want to take away? And this is in English, Malay, Chinese, and Tamil. You can go back later and sort of Google which word is which. But also just, so interesting to see how all these words just kind of like get absorbed into our everyday language. Everyone just kind of knows all these words. And when you see these words out in the wild, you feel like, oh my God, someone who actually knows the language and actually knows the culture wrote all these things. All right. So lots of context, which hopefully will be relevant now. How does this translate to work? So I'm going to show a couple of examples. First of all, this is a very interesting example from India that I wanted to share with you. This was an interesting thread that actually someone on my team shared with the rest of us. And it's from a PM. So Prashant Singh is a PM at Paytm, which is another payment app in India. And the gist of it, which I found so interesting, was that some users don't always understand the words or icons we use. Many users are taught how to perform very simple functions by friends and family. So someone might teach you, for example, how to pay a friend on Google Pay. They might walk you through the very, very specific flow in the app, and you memorize that flow, memorize the interactions. You make sure that you remember icons. You make sure that you remember specific words. And that's how you navigate through the app. So, for example, like in our app, for example, someone might not actually know what the word subscription means, but they might see it often enough in the app that they know that if I want to go to this specific experience, I should look for this specific word that looks for this and tap on it and navigate my way through. I also really like this example for this specific audience because it was an example of how they had learned how to do this from a Chinese app, which, as you see below, a lot of youngsters were actually navigating their way through Chinese porn apps and then figuring out the navigation through there. So also just very fun example of how, that sort of like muscle memory, and as content designers, really thinking about standard words that we're using is so important, even when people don't necessarily read or understand the words that we're using. The other pretty cool thing, which I realized writing for so many of these different markets, is sort of how language often has a class dimension. So this chart, for example, is from India, where English is used as the language of business. It's used as the language that folks learn a lot of things in. And because of that, certain things like a payments app, for example, or like, making payments, doing business, all these things are commonly done in English. So a lot of folks might, even if English is not necessarily their first language, a lot of these experiences are in English. A lot of the common words are in English. So someone might be speaking in Hindi, for example, but they might recognize the word transaction, or they might recognize the phrase check balance, because that's what they would usually say if they were going to the bank or talking to someone or talking to a partner who comes and talks to them. So they might navigate through the app looking for words that are familiar to them, even if they don't necessarily understand everything, just because these are the words that matter. And of course, that's also, something we've seen in other markets. Japan is a really cool one where, folks who know the language can probably share a little bit more. But where there's katakana, there's also, English words that are sort of in that Japanese script. It's also just very interesting in terms of how younger versus older people as well interact with these languages. So I think this is the first UX screen I've actually shared. But this is a fun example from BIM, which is a payments app in India by the Indian government, or an Indian government board. It's pretty cool here how I think if you see this, you'll see that there's a call to action called listen answer, which is not technically grammatically correct, but makes sense to the audience here, where it's super simplified. As soon as you see it, you know what it means. And, I think a lot of the work we do as well, sometimes we take some, what's the word I'm using? What's the word I'm looking for? I guess we make some exceptions for grammar, especially where, sometimes it can help with clarity. So this is a cool example, something that I thought was just so interesting. I think we've also seen that sometimes just showing the sort of like speaker icon or microphone icon might not necessarily be clear to people who are new to digital experiences. So something like this, for example, could make this a little clearer to folks. The other thing that's really cool as well is I think something you'll see quite commonly in India apps is that they'll have language selectors that are pretty prominent. So even though the experience is in English, and even though this is actually a language selector within a feature within the app, you'll see a lot of these sort of like in context experiences where when the language is a little bit more complicated, they still give you the option to translate just this language. So yeah, pretty cool. Someone mentioned English earlier, and yes, very interesting to put language selection inside a feature. So someone mentioned English earlier as well. Not sharing, I think I'm still doing good and not sharing any actual examples. But this was something that popped up on LinkedIn about one of the features we worked on. And I love the fact that, like, yes, so English, just for those who are not familiar with it, English is actually, in this context, a mix of Hindi and English written in the Romanized script. And there are, of course, many reasons why someone might choose to interact with a digital experience in English instead of Hindi or English. It could be that they don't know how to read the Hindi script. Another thing is, another reason might be that just typing in a script that's not English is also sometimes a little bit harder, especially when your keyboard was optimized for English. But so many reasons why someone might prefer to use English. What I really liked about this was not just that it was helpful, but that folks really felt that this was a feature that recognized the cultural nuance and cultural need in this market. And that was what made it resonate so much. All right. And of course, other than voice and simplifying language and doing all these other things, it's cool to also see how some other markets in some other parts of the world, this is an example from Indonesia, where a lot of startups actually have agents that, one example is you could actually go into your local shop, have an agent kind of like use his app and buy something for you. So also a way where people are sort of like broaching or like bridging the gap in cultural experiences around the world. Something else that I'd really love to hear from you as well, if you've seen really cool examples of this, is voice. And it's pretty cool because I think there are two dimensions to this, right? There is one, of course, hearing something in a different language, hearing something through voice, which can be helpful when your reading is not as great in a certain language. But there's also the voice aspect and you being able to interact with the experience when otherwise this might feel uncomfortable if you don't know how to write in the language, for example. So yeah, a lot of accessibility examples of how people have bridged cultural nuances and cultural differences. Something else that I have found pretty cool, and I think you might see examples of this around the world. Language is always a little bit political. And I think for me as well, when I was growing up, my grandfather was a clerk, and all my parents' siblings were teachers, which meant when I was growing up, Um, there was a big focus on speaking English properly and not sort of the colloquial English that a lot that I would speak in school with my friends or with other folks. As soon as I got home, I needed to speak proper English. And I think you'll see a lot of that sort of like running through the content that we've seen in some of these countries in the past, where there's this big focus on, speaking proper, good English. And one thing I really liked is that very recently you've seen folks sort of embrace a lot more of this English and like, introducing sort of like local elements in the language, in the written language as well. Just, sort of seeing how the written language is also reflecting the spoken language in some of these markets. And this is one of my favorite examples. So these are all screens from Singapore, and they're all localized in very, very different ways. The first screen, someone who knows better should correct me. I think it's either from Revolut or Wise. This is obviously a Singaporean screen because you can see that it's the Monetary Authority of Singapore. But the style of writing, the way it's written, very standard global English. You'll find writing like this anywhere in the world. The second screen is from Grab, which is a local ride-hailing service in Singapore and Southeast Asia. And you'll see the phrase "go where," which is if you're not from this part of the world, it's a very economical way of speaking that's very common in Singapore. So, for us, it's like if you can use one word, if you can use two words, why say an entire sentence? So this, I think, for Singaporeans, if you see this, you're like, yes, this feels very Singaporean. The last one is super Singaporean. So I think for those who may speak some Chinese, Mandarin, or other languages as well, this is an app called Bus Uncle in Singapore. It's an app that lets you know when the next bus is coming. Here you'll see things like MTCA, smart haul, which are all phrases that kind of mix the local language and English. And what I find very interesting about this, of course, is that if you look across these three screens, one is a global company from around the world. One is a Southeast Asian company that's local, but with more than one market. And the last one is a brand or an app that is only in Singapore. And I find it very interesting, I think, when we think about hyperlocalization and introducing cultural nuances in our experiences. I do think sort of like how we write or our brand presence in these markets also plays a big part in how free we can be with writing in this way. And, some bigger brands, for example, if they were to write in the last way, for example, this might feel a little bit cringe, but Bus Uncle gets away with it. So yeah, I think, when you think about cultural context as well, there's always sort of a balance between your brand and this. And I like to call it sort of like the McDonaldizing of this experience. The McDonald's, for example, is a global brand, but they do a lot of very interesting things in different markets. But still, keep that sort of like global essence. Okay, I think we've got a couple more things. This is a question that I like asking folks. Do you think we in Asia are a little bit more delightful than our Western counterparts? If you've read the culture map, I can't recommend it more. It's a really great book that looks at all these different levers across things like gender and like power dynamics and how different cultures do things differently. And one of the things they look at is how confrontational and emotionally expressive folks are in different places. So, this is, of course, a generalization. Not everyone in every country is this way. But yeah, I think, like as someone who writes for India, for example, I think emotionally expressive is something that, comes to mind a lot when I look at some of the UX or the art or the digital experiences that I see in different places. And it's pretty cool when you think about, exceptions versus the norm in different markets. Case in point. And has anyone seen this, for example? Anyone knows what brand or what experience this is from? All right. So this is Marie Kondo, and these are her YouTube channels. One is in the US and one is in Japan. So if you look to the left is what you'll find in the US. Very beautiful, very Muji. All the headers are, standardized. There's a format to all the headers. On the right, you'll see the Japanese version, which, as someone who has written for some of these Eastern markets, you'll see that sort of like even in the, what's this word? Even in the thumbnails, you'll see the sort of like, writing across the image, the banner and the image. Very interesting to, sort of see the sort of like busyness in all these different apps, different experiences. I'm very interested in knowing why they decided on this brand direction. But it was pretty cool to see, how things were so different for just the same brand. But at the same time, I think like some of this can be an overgeneralization. This is an example of, two Instagram ads. One is from the US, one is from India. They obviously look very, very alike. Um, but I've come to the realization that maybe difference in how much creative freedom we can have. A lot of it is the brand perception, and sometimes we're able to some markets were able to add these local touches, even as a big brand. Some markets were not. So yeah, I think like beyond the brand perception as well, you'll see sometimes that different markets have a different appetite for how much hyperlocalization can be done. uh oh wow, what's this? Yeah, but yeah, I think again going back to McDonald's as well. I'm curious to know whether anyone here is also a fan of going to McDonald's in different countries and seeing how far they deviate from the main menu, because I find it very cool how far certain markets go and how closely certain markets meet that sort of like baseline menu. All right. I think we are close to the end, but this is one of my favorite topics when it comes to designing across cultures and maybe relevant to quite a few folks here. Just sort of like looking at West versus East UI. Maybe also a bit of an overgeneralization, but a lot of Asian users had their first digital experience on a phone and not a laptop. And so layout like this is very, very common in APAC. There's grid design. Folks sort of like um, think a lot more about how they interact in an app by discovering different things. So it's a lot more discovery driven than search driven, which is probably a lot more common in the West. I like to think about the Asian UX experience as like shopping in IKEA, where you're sort of just wandering around, discovering new things, versus, when you go into a supermarket sometimes and you just go right up to the aisle that you want. Something I've also heard in in Asia is that some users like that feeling of having more, and so the busier the app, the better. I did work at a startup with one CEO who used to tell us off whenever there was white space, which isn't something I've heard recently, but also, not good or bad, just different. So yeah, this is also common in India. You'll see a lot of the same grid design. Again, it's so cool seeing how design just kind of I don't want to use this word spread. I think it's just interesting to see the influence of different styles of design in different markets. So very cool to see, for example, how India has this sort of design that feels very Chinese, if I may say. And in Southeast Asia, for example, I think we don't have as many of these things, but you will see a very good mix of sort of that West and Eastern design. We do have a lot of grids. We also have a mix of feeds in between, but very interesting again to see, especially in different markets like this, how different UI influences come into play. And as content designers as well, writing for these different experiences is not always the same. Just thinking, of course, how, some people are coming in very much discovery, wanting to do, wanting you to show them everything on home. And, then they decide where to go versus like thinking of it from a very purely navigational viewpoint where you're trying to guide someone step by step through your experience. So pretty cool how we've had to think about all these different interaction styles. And yeah, this has been a challenge for me as an English writer. This interface was maybe not designed with English in mind, but has become so prevalent. And so I have a lot of empathy for translators as well, because it's not always easy trying to fit 8 to 11 characters under a chat head when you have this much space. So it's been a fun, interesting challenge trying to write for a market that prefers this style while still having to be in English. All right. Just to wrap things up with a final example, this is an app in Singapore. It's called Shopback. I like to share it as sort of what I like to think as good Asian content design in action. Some people who have seen it find it a bit busy, find it a bit chaotic. But what I like about it, from a sort of like Asian content design perspective, is if you look at the entire screen, you'll see that everything sort of feels very differentiated, which makes it easy for someone scrolling through the screen to quickly recognize that these are different elements on the screen. There's a very clear hierarchical, there's a lot of thought when it comes to the hierarchy of things shown on the page, whether it's the text, whether it's the colors, whether it's the components. You'll see like small things, bigger things, and they all sort of like draw attention in very different ways depending on how important they are. Not a lot of white space. A lot of emphasis on like short text, a lot of like reward numbers, a lot of like exclamation marks. Not all of this is good or bad, but I think like what stands out to me is that this is designed and written in a way that is meant to call attention to things for someone who is scanning and trying to discover things in a very different way from someone who's going through a feed, for example. So yeah, you'll see also like a lot of things like iconography, so many different icons. You'll see art that is very literal. And when I say literal, I think something that I hope you notice a little bit more is that the art in some of our Asian apps is often very graphic and literal. You can see people literally showing both their phones to each other. And that, kind of plays into the fact that, we're also writing for audiences with very different literacy levels. And the art just complements the content so much in some of these markets. All right. If there are three things I hope you take away from this, and I hope it was super useful. One, localization, translation, writing, so important. Localization is also a lot more than that. Thinking about cultural context, thinking about the UI that you use, thinking about class dimensions, thinking about all these different things. Localization goes beyond thinking about just the words, but also thinking about the emotion behind your words, all those other feelings and thoughts that go into this. Second is cultural relevance. In a lot of these markets, what I have personally found really heartening to hear is whenever something goes out that feels local and someone looks at it and is like, oh my God, this feels like India, or this feels like Singapore. This feels like someone in this market really understood this. And sometimes it's often something pretty small, but it matters. And I think when someone looks at your app and thinks like, okay, this person gets it, it makes a big difference when you get these sort of like little cultural nuances. Last one, something that's been really interesting to me is that so many of these things feel pretty local, but I have seen, as someone lucky, fortunate enough to work in different markets, how you see certain patterns in the most different of markets. And so I think anything you learn from your local market is always super interesting to someone from a different market. Um, Sometimes it's something that solves a problem that already exists in a different market in a very interesting way. Sometimes it's a new learning that is also interesting in that market. Something I found kind of relevant thinking about this as well is how, just thinking about the fact that for those of us who live in Asia, um, having grown up with the phone as your first experience, this is actually the reality of most Gen Z users today. And so a lot of the stuff we're doing in this market as well is probably interesting and relevant as we think about, as other markets, or even as we think about the next generation of users. All right. That's all for today. Thank you so much for humoring me and taking the time to be here today.
All right. Thanks a lot, Stephanie. That was super interesting. We have a lot of positive comments. Yes, it's really nice. We also have a lot of questions that I took note of them, so I can walk you through a couple of them if you want.
Sure. Of
All
course.
right. Perhaps let's start with this one that is kind of tied up to the way you ended up your presentation with your three main takeaways. Um, a question, one of your first takeaway was localization is more than just translation. And during your talk, Anna asked, in your opinion, does it even make sense to translate UX content? If interface is created for APAC, what are the chances that it will look clear for users in Germany? The proper copy wouldn't even fit. So, and she concluded, maybe it's better to build it from scratch, saying that perhaps, localization is more than just translation. Perhaps there is something else to be done here. What's your take on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think That slide I shared with the three examples from Singapore was probably a good example of how different companies may want to think about how much they hyper localize differently, right? So I imagine, again, going back to my favorite McDonald's example, McDonald's has a main menu, but they probably have a playbook. I'm just thinking, I imagine they do. I think they have a playbook for how they localize in different countries. And there's still sort of like a main sort of baseline experience that is consistent everywhere. But there's a lot of thought that goes into that, maybe 30% that is localized. So that could be, one way of thinking about it. I think the other thing I like to think about is that we also have a lot more similarities than differences. And sometimes we also want to look at where we're similar and then, focus a lot more of our time with the localization where we're different. And same thing as UXs, we also always think about systems. Where can we systemize? Where would we want to spend a bit more time on things that are divergent? And so I think about local hyper localization in that way as well. Like, be smart about where you choose to focus your cultural localization energy, especially if you're not on a team that has the luxury of localizing everything.
All right. Another one, another question. This one from Ashley. Do you ever meet resistance to introducing non-standard English in these digital experiences, like Hinglish? I assume she's referring to Singaporean English. Um, how do you respond to it?
That's a very good question. Um, I think it also depends on what we're introducing. So I think, like, one, I think sometimes as an in-market team, when we're talking about something where someone might not always have context, they are willing to give us the benefit of the doubt and be like, hey, yep, that sounds like you know what you're doing. But there are also things where, like, I think, we talked a little bit about like the grammar flexibility,
Mhm.
where for me that feels like sometimes someone somewhere else might see that and be like, this just feels like broken English. Or where, we looked at like that really busy UX, and that felt for me like, yeah, I can understand why someone might have designed it this way. But if I were to, show it to someone who maybe is a bit more of a UX purist, they'd be like, is this good UX? So I think something that has really helped is indexing a lot on local research insights. Sharing a lot of like, um, not for copying purpose, but just sharing like a lot of local apps as well, and sort of like building an understanding of some local um, patterns that maybe some others are doing as well. I think a lot of education helps. I think people usually fear what they don't know. So sometimes just bringing them along for the ride helps.
Okay. Okay. And following up on this, another question from Ashley. How do you test your language choices with users?
Research is big. I think just as a content designer in general, so of course, when you think about content design research, there's so many different ways of doing it. There's talking to your users. I love sitting in research studies and hearing users talk about experiences in their own words. Sometimes when you get a study, of course, like there's so much stuff that's super helpful, but things might get translated or like translated and everything. So it's always just so helpful to hear them talk about certain things, because you're like, huh, this person used this very specific word whenever they were talking about it, even though in all our screens we were using a different word. So you always catch little things like that. That's always so interesting to see. We look at things like, I love also sort of looking at like Reddit and Facebook or LinkedIn, and like sort of looking at how people talk about these things just day to day, because it's also interesting again what words they use. just when they're trying to like communicate how they've been describing this to each other. I look at Google Trends. Sometimes,
Yeah.
honestly, I just Google a word or different words and see how many results pop up, and I'm like, oh, okay, this is not a popular word. Or search trends are really cool, especially for looking at different markets. Sometimes I just search for the same word and look at like five different markets and how prevalent different words are. So yeah, a lot of research, metrics, data is always super helpful as well.
All right. Going back to more about the topic of localization, Anna asked, "Do you have an example of an international brand, sorry, doing hyper localization?"
And an international brand
Specifically,
doing hyper
excuse
like
me, specifically something IT related, because your example with McDonald's is brilliant, but I want to hear about an IT company who does something to that extent.
that is a very good question. I think maybe someone, I don't know, I'd love to see if the audience also, if like folks have good examples of that. I think with a very, very, very large global company, maybe not a lot of examples are coming to mind now. I feel like Duolingo maybe is also a sort of like global experience, and they sort of introduce cultural nuances, but it's also maybe not hyper localized. Um, but I feel like maybe the companies that I have seen do this sort of localization really well is regional companies where they are not global, but they are maybe like European companies that have a few different markets in Europe, or like Asian companies that have a few different markets in a certain part of the world. I think that there maybe sometimes it's, the ability to move fast in market, being close to many markets as well, um, and maybe also having markets that have many similarities and some differences where you can scale a lot more. But yeah, I'm happy to be proven wrong. Like I don't know. I don't. Nothing comes to mind right now.
Okay, tough questions. But on the
Tough
topic
question.
of hyper localization,
Actually,
she
wait. I
also,
think. Sorry.
oh,
Actually, I think Uber maybe does. I feel like Uber maybe does a pretty good job with localization, because I
mhm.
think like in different markets they have very different features, and they also localize their content and art a little bit. So maybe Uber. I think Uber does a pretty good job with hyper localization.
Okay. Anna, does it answer your question? Yes, okay. Right. On the topic of hyperlocalization, she also asked, um, hyperlocalization implies hiring a lot of local people who are part of cultural context. What is the return on investment of that, and how would you convince your organization to take that route?
I think there are two answers to this. I think one, yes, hyper localized local teams often have a lot of strong local knowledge, which I think I've seen just been completely blown away by the sort of like different ideas that come from someone who's so familiar with the market. At the same time, I've also seen how just like really, really, really taking your time to immerse yourself in a culture can also be helpful. And some of these experiences are different, right? So I think like if you're looking at something like a video sharing app, that's something that's purely online, where you maybe can actually do a lot of research and really, really immerse yourself in the local culture, even if you're not in the country itself. Whereas maybe something like payments or ride sharing, where there's sort of like an offline aspect to it as well, that may be something where having the cultural knowledge or really being able to interact with like merchants or partners or drivers, or like being out on the road, like, there maybe that local context really really matters in a different way. So yeah, I mean, I don't have a concrete answer to that. I think like there are a lot of experiences where we can still immerse ourselves in cultures and
Mhm.
learn different things. And there may be some experiences where, you know, it's quite hard to replace that local context.
Mm. It kind of ties up with the question from Pedro, which is when you first started, sorry, as a writer for international audience, was there anything that you really struggle with?
Absolutely. I think like even today, I feel like I am honestly learning so many different things. My team right now, we have writers in India, writers in Japan, writers in Singapore, and I learned so many new things. Like I think the other day I learned about the phrase set-top box, which in India is actually the it's sort of like a box that you put on top of your TV that is for your TV service provider. And when I saw it, I was like, this feels like wrong. This feels like wrong grammar. And then I Googled it and it was an actual thing. And like everyone on the team who heard it was like, yeah, this is an actual thing. Did you not realize this is, and it was interesting to me that folks on the India team who were talking about it did not realize that it was not common outside India. They just took it as like matter of fact that folks knew what this was. So yeah, I think it's yeah, cool. Still learning a lot of new things even today.
Okay. On the topic as well of, when you first started, um, I believe his name is Noshin. I hope I pronounced that correctly. Ask how to tackle localization with a small team, and also he is adding, um, since we are creating a content design system, want to understand if localization should be considered in the inclusivity section, I would suppose, of the content design system. So, how to tackle localization with a small team? Would you put localization in inclusivity section, I would say, of a content design system?
Yeah, absolutely. Those are really, really, really great questions. Um, when I was at my last place, for example, I think I would consider us, a pretty small team, and our end goal was like, hey, let's make sure we have really great localized content in each market, and we did that through very hacky ways. So we had a standard process, which was like, yes, I think we were using Fiverr at the time for our translation, so please apologies. But what we also did then was like, all these strings got translated, but then we made had like a net we put out sort of like a note to everyone in the company, and we were like, hey, anyone here feels really really confident in their Japanese, anyone feels really confident in their Vietnamese, do you have like maybe 2 to 3 hours every month, volunteer for like this quick group. And we would get like maybe 2 to 3 people for each language, so it wasn't just reviewed by one person. There was sort of like different people reviewing, able to call out different things. So yeah, I think we've done hacky things like that, but just sort of like understanding that the end goal is always just, getting really good localized content in.
Okay. All right. We have. I would like to ask you perhaps two last questions that we have here. First one is from Bridget. A great question. Have you ever experienced challenges when it comes to maintaining global brand consistency while at the same time localizing UX for different markets? And if so, what are some approaches you suggest?
Absolutely. I think like that's it's one of the fun things we get to navigate a lot. Yeah, I mean, I think, and the challenge is not always someone not understanding, right? The challenge is sometimes purely engineering, like the cost of having to maintain so many different versions of something might be very high. So I think, a lot of questions to ask yourself in terms of like, what's the sort of like impact of having this difference. If it's a small word and you're like, hey, this makes the experience a little better, but we can live without this, and the end cost of making this change or maintaining this change is really expensive. Sometimes we're like, okay, you know what, let's not do this. But if we genuinely feel like this makes a really big difference, yeah, I think, we negotiate our way, we show the research, we do all the things we need to do to prove that this is worth doing.
All right, all right. I think a good way to wrap up the questions. Noshin, I saw that you asked another one. We might need to move to the chat room, but feel free to we ask the question in the group on WeChat, if you have WeChat there. No issue at all. But one great question I believe to wrap up would be from Ashley again. Do you have any go-to resources for cross-cultural UX content design that you can refer to us?
Honestly, I know like the two of you, I think, wrote a really, really great article recently for UX writing in China, which I've shared with my team as well, which I thought was really, really good. Um, yeah, um, I think it's still pretty new. I think like a lot of I feel like a lot of the focus when it comes to writing and localization has been on translations, and maybe that's also because of how we've been set up, how we've been working. And it's really nice to see that this has become something that a lot of different people are starting to think about. So that, of course, the content design, the right UX writing in China was such a great article. I've seen a couple of other. I follow a couple of other writers on LinkedIn who write in different markets. Also, really cool to see how they're thinking about different things. But no, I don't know if I've seen someone put together something quite yet about localizing in this way, but I hope to see it soon. I think I feel like it's something that's becoming a lot more of a hot topic these days. So I definitely see this sort of like emerging and like more resources coming up soon.
If I may add to this conversation about resources, I think in addition to what you said, I do agree that it's a growing area, right? How can we do culture sensitive UX writing, and how we can make sure that our UX writing is acceptable for different audiences. And yeah, thank you for the shout out. I can share a couple of resources on content strategy or UX writing for different cultures. First of them would be this book, Global Content Strategy, which is, I think, very very small book. Very small book. I think you can find it online, and it also has like a lot of different strategies of how to adapt globally. So that would be my first resource. And second, there is a course on Udemy, I believe, which is called. Let me find it for a second. Yes, it's called culture-based UX writing uh, by let me remember, Dr. Katerina Grimm. Yeah, I can send the link in the group as well. We started doing that course with my team during lunch breaks, and it's quite interesting. Yeah, so I strongly suggest you guys check it out. It's a good kind of take on how different cultural dimensions actually impact UX writing, and it also has some like little practical exercises you can do by yourself or with your team if you feel like it. So I would say maybe those two resources can also be added to your list.
Yeah, this is so cool. Like I'm also learning something new.
Oh, Ashley,
Fantastic.
looks like you know about the course as well. Culture-based UX writing. That's fantastic. Fantastic.
Yeah, and then for the book, I'll send you a link in a bit. Yeah. Oh
Oh,
my God.
paper as well. Mm.
Wow. Yes. Yes. Oh, wow. Also, yeah, we have quite a few people here who know about that course. So yeah, I think that's also something that maybe we can think about, guys. Maybe we should put together like a library of resources
Yeah.
on the cross cultural writing. I think that would be neat. We can, or like we can do like an overview of different resources on that. I'd love to see that. I'd love to see that, absolutely.